So as you all know, the DNC created a Unity Reform Commission where they brought together delegates from Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, and the DNC chairman, Tom Perez, in order to draft new rules that would reform the DNC and hopefully unite the party. So they've recently concluded that process, and they have recommended a number of reforms that they want the party to incorporate, and this includes changes to caucuses, superdelegates, and transparency. So when it comes to superdelegates, they are substantially reducing the number of superdelegates, but they aren't necessarily going the way of the dodo just yet. So Ada Chavez of The Intercept reports the Democratic Party's Unity Reform Commission on Saturday voted nearly unanimously on a series of proposals aimed at reforming the presidential nominating process, including one that would eliminate 60% of superdelegates. Cutting the number of superdelegates, the commission decided, would be a step toward healing wounds from the 2016 primary. Some superdelegates, such as officers of the DNC and elected state chairs, would maintain their status, but their vote at the convention would be bound by the results of the state election. It was not a complete win, however. Others, such as governors or members of Congress, would still be free to vote for whichever candidate they prefer, regardless of their state's preference. So they're relinquishing some control, but not full control. They still want to be able to tip the scales against a Bernie Sanders type of candidate if push comes to shove. Now, why would a Unity Reform Commission comprised of both Bernie and Hillary delegates not just abolish them completely? Well, it's because this Unity Reform Commission was tilted in favor of the establishment. So Bernie got 7 delegates, Hillary Clinton got 9, Tom Perez got 3. So they would not allow Bernie Sanders delegates to propose abolishing superdelegates altogether. They probably stopped them from doing that. So this is a way of the establishment still clinging to power. Now, is this a step in the right direction? Absolutely. But just go the full way. I mean, it's their way of saying, look, we took this big step to win back your trust, but at the same time, they're making sure that they have the ability, if need be, to overthrow democracy if we choose a candidate that they don't like. Now, when it comes to reforming caucuses, Ruby Kramer of BuzzFeed News explains how they've adopted a measure to allow absentee ballots in caucuses. Quote, the measure would address perhaps the biggest concerns about the caucus process, which are accessibility and flexibility. If voters can't show up in person to a caucus at the allotted time because of work or family obligations, they cannot participate in the primary. Caucus absentee ballots are already available in Nebraska's Democratic Caucus. Now, additionally, for candidates like Martin O'Malley that failed to meet the 15% viability threshold at the Iowa caucus, for example, well, going forward, the initial vote totals will actually be released. So if Martin O'Malley got, say, 13% hypothetically, well, he still wouldn't be able to win that caucus or advance, and the people who were caucusing for him would have either had to switch to Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton, but he still could argue that since he was so close to viability, that he should be able to stay in the race since he was almost viable. Now, another change to caucuses include same-day voter and party registration for caucuses, which is a huge step in the right direction. Now, another thing that definitely needed to happen was states need to open up their primaries. Now, since the DNC, the National Democratic Party, can't compel them to open up their primaries, what they can do is try to persuade them to do that. So what they've included is a way to get these states with closed primaries or really suppressive registration tactics like New York that force people to change their party status to Democrat if they want to participate in a primary nearly 200 days before they cast their vote. Well, what they're doing to address that is, quote, the commission proposed the system to penalize states like this by docking their numbers of pledged delegates should they not adjust deadlines. So this is a huge win. I think that all states should have open primaries. For me, I dem-exited. I changed my status to an independent in 2016 once it was revealed to us that Hillary Clinton rigged the primary against Bernie Sanders with the DNC. Now, if I want to participate in future primaries, I'm going to have to re-register as a Democrat, and I don't want to do that. But I will, if it means I could support a progressive candidate in the Democratic Party that I like. But this is a step in the right direction. Now, when it comes to transparency, they're also taking steps to make sure that joint fundraising agreements like the one Clinton signed in 2015 that we learned about through Donna Brazil don't happen again. So the Unity Reform Commission has included language to make any future JFAs available to all campaigns, so they can't just offer it to one campaign. And they're making sure that law firms can't represent the DNC and one candidate's campaign simultaneously, because Donna Brazil told us about how Perkins Coie LLP was representing the DNC and Clinton's campaign at the same time, which is incredibly unethical, because for an organization like the DNC that claims it's neutral, well, if you have the same legal counsel, then that's a huge conflict of interest. It's unethical. You can't do that. So they are making sure that that doesn't happen. Finally, the commission also voted for a proposal to create an ombudsman council at the DNC, a new body to impartially review and address any complaints or recommend improvements around questions of fairness, neutrality, and transparency at the party. Now, to me, this sounds like a fantastic idea. The only problem is that the person who appoints this ombudsman is the DNC chair, who currently is Tom Perez, who probably doesn't care too much about fairness. So, look, this is a mixed bag. There are some reforms that they agreed upon that I think are just fantastic, and, they're no-brainers. Now, the problem is that all of these recommendations made by the DNC Unity Reform Commission have to go before the aggregate DNC for a vote. In other words, people who are currently superdelegates have to be willing to vote to strip themselves of power if we really want to get rid of superdelegates. So people who serve on the Unity Reform Commission are insisting that they are optimistic that the DNC will, in fact, do this. I'm not so optimistic, but I really hope to be proven wrong here. I really don't see superdelegates voting to restrict their own power. But, we'll see. Now, again, these are just recommendations at this point, and they could have been better. I would have liked to see 100% of superdelegates abolished. I would have liked more when it comes to transparency. I think we need to see how the DNC is spending money, but at the same time, in complaining, I don't want to make it seem as though I'm not appreciative of the work that Bernie Sanders delegates did, because they fought their asses off to get all of this accomplished here. And again, at this point, it's just recommendations. It still will be voted on and has to be voted on before it's approved. But Bernie delegates, they went to bat for progressives like myself. So I want to actually show you a clip of DNC Unity Reform Commission member Nimiki Konst just railing against corruption and the DNC's lack of transparency, because it shows you the amount of work and passion they put in to fight for reform.
Okay. This smells. This doesn't just smell to the public right now that the budget of the party was never put before. Forget about the budgetary committee for a second. Put before the people who have a fiduciary responsibility, whether it's Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, whether it's Donna Brazil when she was chair, when she was vice chair, or Vice Chair Ray Buckley, or Dr. Jim Zogby over here. That's over half the executive committee right there, had no idea where the money was going. We spent $1 billion, lost the easiest presidential race you could possibly imagine, with joint fundraising agreements. State parties weren't being funded. During the DNC chair's race, there were some state party chairs who said, I'm an acting executive director and I have $3,000 cash on hand. How are you supposed to rebuild the party if you have no idea where that money was spent? And you know what? I did go through FEC filings, and it doesn't look good. It smells. We're talking about close to $700 to $800 million between the joint fundraising agreement and the DNC being spent on 5 consultants. Uh-oh. This is not a public outrage issue. The DNC chairs are upset, the officers are upset, and I don't know who's on the Budget and Finance Committee. I did go to the meeting. It was 15 minutes long, and there was a pie chart that was put on screen. Yeah. But I would, as a Democratic Party member of this commission, we have a duty, and people are watching us right now. The number one issue I get asked out in the public by DNC members is, what are you going to do about the budget? It is absolutely ridiculous that we are going to keep a status quo system when it basically says we're going to continue to lose 1,200 seats. Let me describe what losing 1,200 seats looks like, or the remaining seats we have. If you're in Trump, yes, but let's break that down a little bit. If you're in Arizona and you have an ectopic pregnancy, you can't go to a Planned Parenthood clinic because it's gone, because that state legislature is lost. So you have to drive over to New Mexico. And if you bleed to death on the way, you know whose fault that is? In my mind, That's a Democratic Party that wasn't funded, recruiting candidates, investing in local parties. And that is our fault because we have put that money to the top 5 consultants. And part of that has to go to the conflicts of interests. This is outrageous. It's unethical. It's bad governance. And frankly, it's fucking, corruption. So if we do want to look at this Budget and Finance Committee, I advise that it be an elected Budget and Finance Committee. We have very clear standards of oversight, and that it is not just looking at past budgets, but putting forth a budget for debate with the people who have a fiduciary responsibility in that room, so that they can find out, is this an open bid contract? Because the budget, Congresswoman Fudge mentioned it doesn't have to do with vendors. Well, the majority of the budget goes to vendors. So we have to have a conversation about who are those vendors. I agree. And that would happen through a Budget and Finance Committee or another committee. But I think what's key is that committee has oversight and it is elected. Because right now these committees are stacked with whoever the chair decides is on the committee. And I don't know what the chair's interests are because, he's been chair for 8 months. I don't know who he's in line with. But we don't have time. We have a freak in the White House and state legislatures controlled by Republicans and poor state party chairs like Jane Klebb having to go out there and fundraise on her own because the Democratic Party isn't able to allocate money. Well, all that money, we went to presidential races, but it was burned, lit on fire. And who suffers as a result of some consultants getting 3rd, 4th, and 5th homes? The American people. People being rounded up by ICE. Let's keep this in perspective right now. We have a duty here, and it is not just a duty to our committeemen and the status quo. It's a duty to the American people, to the Democratic Party members, to the DNC chairs, to the DNC members, the executive committee members, and the people who have a fiduciary responsibility.
So that was absolutely fantastic. I am so thrilled to have someone like Nimiki Kantz representing our side who is not afraid to speak truth to power, literally. Now, one thing about all of these changes is that, we took one step forward, a couple steps back, because recently the DCCC instituted some changes of their own for the 2018 elections. So according to Michael Tracy of TYT Investigates, the DCCC is mandating that campaigns must agree, quote, not to engage in tactics that do harm to our chances of winning a general election. The memo does not identify what tactics it is prohibiting. Candidates also must hold a unity event with their primary opponents following a primary, the memo says. What would constitute a unity event also is not made explicit. Now, Michael Tracy learned about this by obtaining a memo, an internal memo from the DCCC. So while the DNC may be voting to reform the party and make it more democratic, the DCCC is making sure that they hurt progressive candidates, because in saying that you can't do anything by creating this requirement that you, quote, cannot engage in tactics that do harm to our chances of winning the general, that basically means you can't critique your opponent. So if you have someone who's brazenly corrupt like Joe Manchin, his opponent, Paula Jean Swearengin, is not supposed to critique him, well, how do you run a campaign then? So the whole point about running primaries is to make sure that the strongest opponent emerges. And if that opponent is really going to go on to defeat a Republican, that individual should be able to take criticism from his or her own side. So this is just ridiculous and preposterous. How do you expect people like Paula Jean Swearengin, we'll use that example again, and Joe Manchin to come together for a unity reform or a unity event, after the campaigns are over? How do you expect people like Amy Vilela to get together with a scumbag like Ruben Kewin, who's accused of sexual misconduct, and hold a unity event with him? Is she not allowed to criticize him? I mean, this is ridiculous. So look, if the DNC votes to approve these changes that were recommended to them by the DNC Unity Reform Commission, it's a step in the right direction. But make no mistake about it, the DNC has a long way to go before they earn back our trust. And we have to be skeptical because they've screwed us over so many times, and they're still trying to make sure that they tip the scales against us. So we have to be cognizant of their desire to cling to power.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.